Okay, so this is a new space. I did move and I got a new job, and it's been like a little less than 2 months. I think so far it's going really well. It's always hard to tell how well something's going in a transition, but so far I'm really enjoying it and wanted to give that very short disclaimer. With the whole transition, I was like, maybe I should hold off on doing any kind of like reading vlog slash trying to read a classic, just because like there's a lot going on obviously with any transition, but I'm really craving a gothic novel. And I think it's mostly the time of year because it's nearly October, like tomorrow will be October. Clearly I have started decorating for Halloween. And I was like, I think I just want to read Jane Eyre. So I've already started a little bit. You can kind of see I'm about 100 pages in, but not quite, but close. Before I do a recap, I am gonna just kind of talk a little bit about Jane Eyre and my history with it, because this is another book that I read in high school, but I read it as a class project for AP Literature, and I got to actually like choose this book. So I think that definitely helps with any kind of required reading, is being able to kind of have the illusion of choice with it. And I loved it. I loved it in high school. I'm pretty sure it was my senior year. Yeah, it was definitely my senior year. I actually did have a copy that my parents had that I annotated, and I'm hoping that eventually I can find that copy, because I think it'd be really interesting to see what were the things I was noting and picking up when I was like 17. Let me do a quick recap. So I am still in Jane's childhood phase. We start off the book with meeting her benefactors, which are also like her relatives because both of her parents have died. And it's an aunt. I don't know the exact lineage. I don't know if it's her mom's side or her dad's side. I'm pretty sure it's her mom's, because I think there's alluding to the fact that her dad was not very wealthy. So if she went to any of those relatives, then she would be pretty much living in poverty. So they see taking Jane in as like an act of charity, and they treat her terribly, of course. The uncle is dead, so it's just the aunt, and her name is Mrs. Reed. So if I ever talk about the Reed family, that's who it is. I don't think they come up a ton at this point, but you know, it might be applicable later on. And also there's two girls, and then there's a guy, and the guy is the oldest and also is terrible, like literally punches Jane in the face at one point. So she's not in a great situation, and they decide to make her go to kind of a boarding school. They call it a charity school because it's specifically a boarding school like for orphans. So she is now there, and we're starting to like see her get a little bit more settled into it as like the one good kind teacher, kind of like the Mrs. Honey of this novel. Her name is Miss Temple, and then you also have a friend named Helen, who, if I remember correctly, I think is kind of an anchor for Jane and shows her like how to help reel in her temper and use that temper more strategically rather than just like having explosions of rage, which I'm loving. I love the female rage. It does make me sad in later part of the novel where we don't see it as often. I'm sure it's always there, but it's just like it's not quite as fueled. Yeah, I mean, I think that's pretty much the summary that I can give at this point. Overall, I would say that this is probably the easiest classic that I've like read, just simply I think writing style wise it works well for a lot of modern audiences compared to something like some of the Jane Austen novels or even like some of the other Bronte sisters. I'm not quite sure like what it is that makes it a little bit easier to read and comprehend. I mean, it's still definitely a Victorian classic. Like, it's not like it's, you know, a fantasy novel from like the 2020s, but in terms of classics, it's definitely a much more accessible one than others. So that's also kind of nice, and I think I kind of need that right now because again, still going through grad school, so I have plenty of other difficult reading challenges my way. But I did want to give that caveat because that is one of the nice things about Jane Eyre, is that it's a little easier to grasp than maybe some of the others at times. But yeah, that's all I got, so we'll see how this goes. I walked around in heels too much and I've hurt my left foot, and now I'm just like limping around the apartment, and I'm just really hoping that when I go into the office later this week, I don't have as much of a sore foot and I don't have to limp around. I just need to like be careful and walk slowly. I don't know if that's gonna happen, but I'm really hoping that that might happen. But yeah, so Jane Eyre. I think I'm at the halfway point, and I'm gonna briefly go over some of the plot points. So I left off talking about the boarding school. We've since moved out of the boarding school. She did teach at the boarding school for a couple years, just for context, and she's now at her first governess job. She mostly is working with the housekeeper, Mrs. Fairfax, and then she is teaching Adele, who is the ward of the estate owner. And you don't meet the owner of the estate until later on. And when you first meet him, you don't realize who it is. Or at least Jane doesn't. Maybe as a reader you do a little bit. I don't remember what I thought my first time reading it. But she is kind of like walking on the side of a country road, and a man with a horse comes up with a dog, and he falls off the horse at one point. She runs up to him and is like, can I get you help? I can either go into town or I can go to the estate and get someone. And he's like, what is your affiliation with the estate? And she's like, oh, I've just started working there. And he doesn't ever actually tell her that he's the owner. He just kind of like asks her questions so that he can put the pieces together. And then she finds out later through one of the servants that he is the owner. The romance between Jane and Rochester, when I first was getting started into it, I was not really feeling it, and I think it's just because the power dynamics between the two of them is a big role. Because I mean, like, it is a employee-employer kind of relationship. Also, there's an age gap, which isn't necessarily uncommon for the historical era, but I mean, still, I think reading it as like modern audience can sometimes feel a little uncomfy, because Jane's 18 and then Mr. Rochester, I think, is like 35 or something. The way that he kind of views her at first, he doesn't seem to give her like a full personhood in his mind, just more of like this quirky girl that like he can ask questions and find some amusement in her answers, just because I don't think that Jane's someone that he would necessarily talk to a lot in his current social circles. Kind of gives like the jock being interested in the weird girl sort of trope, if I had to like make it into a teen rom-com. Some of the things that just kind of happened throughout her time at Thornfield Hall is she goes up into the attic with Mrs. Fairfax, and she hears this like unbridled laugh, and we're led to believe that it's one of the servants named Grace. This isn't necessarily the case, but this is what right now we believe. And then the other thing that happens is that there is a fire that occurs in Mr. Rochester's bedroom, and Jane goes and saves him. Also led to believe that Grace started that as well. And then the other major thing that happens, well, there's two other major things, but we are told that Mr. Rochester is, in theory, going to possibly marry a girl named Mrs. Ingram. And she's coming to the estate to stay with Mr. Rochester for a little bit. The whole scene with Jane where when she finds this out and she realizes that she's kind of falling for Mr. Rochester, she draws a realistic picture of herself with no embellishments, just simply how she is. And then she draws a picture of who she thinks Mrs. Ingram looks like and tries to make her as beautiful as possible, but still within like the things that she knows about Mrs. Ingram. And she says that she's going to pull out these two images to remind herself that she is not Mr. Rochester's, they are not on the same level, it's this other woman, and that whole thing. Kind of like put herself in her place. So, and then the last major scene that just happened is Mr. Mason comes into the party abruptly, who is in theory a friend of Mr. Rochester, and later that night he somehow gets stabbed. And then Mr. Rochester's like, hey Jane, can you please hold down the wound as I go and get a surgeon? So she does that, and then the surgeon comes, fixes him up, and then Mr. Mason leaves, and then her and Mr. Rochester are just like walking in the orchard talking about how beautiful the sunrise is. Very wild, random moment for sure. The other like random note to give is I talked about Villette having a lot of French, and I still stand by that. But there is more French in Jane Eyre than what I had remembered. And I think it's because when I was reading this in high school, I was taking French. So I think it was kind of like cool to sometimes see like the random French sentence here and there and like testing to see if I could translate it myself. With my edition that I have right now, they do have footnotes so I can see the translations, and I think that that's definitely helping. Right, we are now back in this corner. This is like the most put together corner. I should probably just make this the filming corner, but of course want to do a little summary of Jane Eyre so far, and I gotta get out the notes. Very important. So we left off with Jane and Mr. Rochester walking through an apple orchard together. The next big thing that happens is that she finds out that Mrs. Reed, who, you know, was her benefactor when she was a kid, is basically on her deathbed. And the reason why she is dying, there's a couple apparently different things that might be going on, but mostly it's because she is mourning the loss of her son, John, aka the bully from Jane's childhood, because he unalived himself. There's various different things that led to that, and Mrs. Reed is kind of in and out of consciousness and asking for Jane. So Jane's like, okay, I will go. So she leaves, and she intends to only leave for about a week, but she winds up staying there for a month. Mrs. Reed is just still a terrible person. I mean, like, near death has not changed her at all. She just belittles Jane whenever she actually sees Jane, and it's a whole thing. But I did want to like read the last line of that chapter because I just thought it was so good. Okay, so this is after pretty much Miss Reed just died. Eliza surveyed her parent calmly. After a silence of some minutes, she observed, with her countenance, she should have lived a good old age. Her life was shortened by trouble. And then a spasm constricted her mouth for an instant. As she passed it away, she turned and left the room, and so did I. Neither of us had dropped a tear. I just love the neither of us had dropped a tear part. Like, oh my gosh. And the build up to that, beautiful. So then Jane returns to Thornfield, and after kind of beating around the bush some, her and Rochester wind up confessing that they both love each other. And at that moment, Rochester is like, will you marry me? And she's like, yes, of course. So they start to get together the wedding arrangements. It's a pretty like, you know, not solemn, a pretty small ceremony that they're planning because Jane doesn't really have any relatives and Rochester doesn't really have any relatives, so it's supposed to be a quiet, small ceremony. But the night before her wedding, she gets a bunch of nightmares, and then she's haunted by who we assume, again, to be Grace Poole, and this figure tries on her wedding dress, her veil, and then rips up the veil, and then flees into the night, kind of thing. So Jane's obviously spooked by that. And Rochester's like, at first he does kind of gaslight her. He's like, you're crazy. This didn't happen. It's all in your dream. She's like, no, I can see that the veil is still ripped up. And he's like, okay. So it was half dream, half real. Part of it was Grace having a mental breakdown and like tearing up your veil, but some of it was actually a dream, which is why she looked so different from how you see her. And Jane's like, I don't believe you. Like in her mind, she's like, I don't believe you, but like, okay. So then they are at the actual like ceremony, and the priest does the whole part of like, you know, if anyone thinks these couples should not be wed or whatever. And then Mr. Mason comes back in and is like, actually, Rochester has a wife. He can't be doing this. So Jane's like, please explain yourself. They go up into the attic. Grace Poole is there attending to Bertha, Rochester's first wife, who is the actual person that's been behind all of these random weird things. And Mason is Bertha's brother. So that's how it's all related. And Rochester kind of tells the story of Bertha and how they met and why they're married. And it's very much like an arranged marriage situation. He moved to the West Indies to be with her, and over time got a little bit more violent with things until now that she is considered a mad woman. And that's why she's locked up in the attic. It sounds like it's for his safety and, in theory, her safety against her own violence, which is why they have Grace attend to her. There's a lot, obviously, to unpack with Bertha, and I do want to actually, like, read some scholarly works a little bit to get more in depth with that, but for right now, I can just briefly say colonialism, racism, and sexism are all playing roles here, I feel. But I will hopefully have a little bit more substance on that in maybe my final thoughts. So after Jane hears all of this, she's like, well, the thing is that you can't marry me because you have a wife and she's alive. So I would basically become your mistress, and I don't feel okay about doing that. I'm going to remove myself from the situation. I'm just going to leave Thornfield and all of your connections. So that way we don't have to feel the pain of like what would have been or whatever, and see each other and mourn each other, or like whatever. So there's a lot of back and forth with that, and you can tell that Jane really doesn't want to do it, but she knows that it's what she needs to do. So she has now left Mr. Rochester and has gone her own way, and now she's just kind of like wandering the country figuring out what to do and how to get work and what her next step is. So that's basically the recap. The only other thing that I did want to briefly note is that when I was trying to describe Jane and Rochester's initial relationship and why I felt kind of like ick about it, Mrs. Fairfax actually said it best. She noted that Jane seems like a pet to him, and I'm like, that's it. So that's really what I was trying to say at that point. It continued, she definitely gets a lot more personhood in his eyes, and there's some beautiful lines that do come out of Mr. Rochester towards Jane. So is he redeemable? Yes and no. I think for modern audiences, it's really hard to get past what he's done to Bertha. But I think for the time period, there's just too much stigma around mental health concerns, especially for women, and also the added layer of white supremacy being at play, that I'm sure that what he did for Bertha was seen as fine. But yeah, so I do want to dive into a little bit more of that later, but for right now, that's a little recap. Did make it through Jane Eyre. It's been a couple days. I took a moment to reflect, gather my thoughts a little bit here, but let's just do like a quick recap of the plot. So we left Jane with her leaving Thornfield Hall, and she kind of just wanders the streets for a little bit and then almost dies from starvation, but she doesn't, because she stumbles on a house where there's a pastor, and they take her in, which is like the pastor is named St. John Rivers, and then he has two sisters that live with him, Diana and Mary. So they take her in and try to like nurse her back to health. They're able to find a job for her, which is to be like a schoolhouse teacher, which is definitely like presented as kind of like below her pay grade, so to speak, being like a governess in a wealthy estate to then just being like a rural schoolhouse teacher, where you're not going to teach like the fancy stuff like French, but more just like basic spelling. She continues to have some relationship between, like a friendship relationship between John, Diana, and Mary. Their like kind of estate, but not really estate, is called the Moore House. Just so you know, that's the name for it. But like through this, John eventually does propose to Jane, but both of them aren't necessarily like attracted to each other. It's more of like a marriage of convenience where John's actually in love with this other girl, but he knows because he's a pastor and he needs to go on missionaries and stuff that Jane would be a better fit for that lifestyle, so to speak. So he's kind of more like, I would like you as a business consultant. But the thing is that like he can't just be like, oh, you're my friend and we'll go to India together. Like we need to be married to be doing that. Otherwise it's like pretty much frowned upon in society and whatnot. But Jane says no. And she kind of has like this spiritual moment of feeling like a call towards Rochester. So it's been actually a whole year, by the way, since she first left. So at this point she's kind of like, let me just go back and see if he's okay. So she eventually does, and then she runs into this guy at like in a village nearby Thornfield Hall that is like, oh yeah, that estate burnt down. And she's like, what do you mean? And so then we hear the backstory of the fact that most likely Bertha set the house on fire, and then as everyone was rushing out, she went up to the roof and Rochester started to go back in to try to save her, but then she jumps off and unalives herself. And then Rochester does make it out, but he is now blind and also has like I think he has one missing limb, and then he also doesn't have like one eye or something, and then the other eye I think is just like it's there but he just can't see out of it because of smoke or whatnot. So basically he is disabled, and it's out where he's living, and she goes to him, and it's actually kind of a really nice scene of like her telling him that like she's really here, and he's like blind and is like, am I dreaming? And she's like, no, like I'm here, and like holding his hand, and like him recognizing her and like realizing that her voice is truly her voice and not just like a phantom of his imagination. Like it's a nice moment. Yeah, like that's basically the recap of things. The main things that I do kind of want to note from like this fourth-ish half of the book is, one, the fact that we see John as kind of like a foil for Mr. Rochester, and I do think that that's really helpful with making Mr. Rochester feel like the love interest that you're rooting for, because as I said, there is that little moment where he's kind of treating Jane as like a pet, not a full person, and then they start to actually see each other as full people, and it gets a little bit better, but then it gets a little bit manipulative feeling because of the whole like, oh, I was going to propose to Mrs. Ingram, but now that I know how you really feel, I won't do it and I'll propose to you. Like, that was questionable. And of course, the whole, like, Bertha situation is questionable, but it does feel slightly redeeming that he at least was like, I need to go in and save her, and isn't just like, this is an opportunity for my wife to die. He gets some points there for trying to go in and save the woman that he locked up in the attic. But then also, like, there's a passage in the book where it becomes way more obvious the fact that John is supposed to be a foil, not just in personality but also in looks, and I kind of like it because it throws in some like Greek/Roman mythology, so I'm gonna read that part really quick. In this scene, basically Jane tells Rochester that she was proposed to and like explains who John is and stuff, so that way like he's aware. So he says, your words have detained very prettily a graceful Apollo, his appearance to your imagination, tall, fair, blue-eyed, and with a Grecian profile. Your eyes dwell on a Vulcan, a real blacksmith, brown, broad shoulders, and blind and lame into the bargain. So basically, he likens John to Apollo, god of light and whatnot. Well, really the sun, but, and then in poetry and stuff like that, which is actually kind of funny because Rochester is definitely the more romantic one and John is way more serious. And then Rochester likens himself to Vulcan, who is like the god of fire and volcanoes, and he's known to be a blacksmith, and also he is known to be disabled, much like Rochester at this moment. And he's also kind of known as like, of the 12 like deities in Mount Olympus, to be quote unquote the lesser one. So anyways, I just, I love a good Greek mythology moment, is really the point of that. Another case for being foil is Jane and Bertha. With Bertha, some important things to note is, one is that she is Creole, so she has Spanish descent, and then two, she at least grew up or was raised in the West Indies, so that definitely has some background for why there is layers of racism and imperialism that are kind of sprinkled into her story. So I did do some research on this, as I said that I would, and I'm going to put the article that I looked at to kind of get some ideas and what I will be quoting from, just like below here. So it says, Jane as an emblem of Christian feminine restraint. Thinking back to the laugh that Jane's obsessed with, and the laugh being like this idea of this unbridledness to Bertha with her own human nature and expression, and that desire that Jane has to also be that way. But that's where her and Bertha kind of see a divide, because they both have passions, they both are unconventional for their time. Neither one of them really want to be put in the box that society has created for them, but unlike Bertha, Jane still finds ways to conform to Victorian ideals, and therefore she's accepted by society. So some of the things that I jotted down from that scholarly paper is, Bertha kind of mimics what Jane is if Jane didn't have her quote morals, which is really just her whiteness. And the madness is tied to the West Indies, because there was like this whole notion that of like the West Indies being like savagery, and how that's almost like contagious, and that's what caused the madness, and like all of that. Like that's some of the rhetoric that was in Victorian society at the time. There is some, you could say, sympathy for Bertha through Charlotte Bronte's telling. Is it still racist in the way that it is written and contextualized? Yes. However, there is a little bit of humanity given to Bertha. Not necessarily in the way that she is physically portrayed, which is where you get a lot of the racism kind of rhetoric happening, but in the way that Jane is willing to relate to her and see her still as a person on some level, and also the fact that Rochester is still willing to see her as a person on some level. That I do think that Charlotte Bronte was trying to create some sort of sympathy / humanity to Bertha, although I don't think she was able to fully do that because of her own biases. The other small thing that I do want to note is Jane does receive some inheritance towards the end of the novel, and I think that's another thing that does kind of seal the deal for me with this romance at the end, is that Jane now has her own wealth and is fully independent, does not need Rochester in any way, and still chooses to be with him. And I think that it helps that there are more equal power dynamics there. Like at the end of the day, she's still going to be a woman, so she's going to have some level of power dynamics in her relationship with a man, especially in this time period. But I think it's a lot more equal than when she first stepped out on marrying him. And I think that that helps a lot with seeing their love / their relationship as something to aspire to in some way, even now. So those are kind of the main thoughts that I had. What else is there to say about Jane Eyre other than I gave it 5 stars, because of course I did. I loved it in high school. I still love it now. Obviously, the whole situation around Bertha is difficult to get through because of the obvious facts that I've already stated. I don't have any more books that I'm planning to do for this year. I did not get a chance to go home and try to find the high school copy that I have, or the copy that I had in high school that I annotated, so we're just gonna leave that up for a mystery. Sorry if anyone was really hyped about that. And I do plan to do more in the future as far as like reading classics and vlogging about it, because I have a lot of classics on my TBR list that I want to get through that I just haven't, and I think it's just because I feel like I want to dissect it when I read it, but it's really hard to hold myself accountable with specifically the dissecting of it when I don't have something like this where I'm forced to say my thoughts out loud. So all to say, I do plan to do some more in the year of 2026. Probably not going to be as themed as I have been doing. I really want to do the color purple. That's been on my list for at least 2 years. Yeah, that's all I got. Hope you guys have a great rest of 2025 because I don't have any other plans for filming things.